This is part 3 of the Ontario Hazelnut IPM workshop series for 2021, Bacterial Blight. My name is Melanie Filitas and I am a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Throughout this series, we will be discussing a number of pest problems common to Ontario hazelnut orchards, including their identification, biology, how to monitor for them, as well as some general pest management practices. For general information on hazelnut scouting and where you can find additional information, refer to part 1 of this webinar series, Introduction to Hazelnut IPM. Bacterial blight is the second most important pathogen affecting Ontario hazelnuts, and most growers in the province can expect to see it on their trees most seasons. It is unlike Eastern Filbert blight, which is restricted to North America, in that it does attack hazelnuts worldwide, and it can attack most parts of the hazelnut tree, including the buds, the leaves, the husk, the branches, and the trunk, although growers often notice it first on the leaves. It's spread by rain or infected nursery stock, and it can invade through wounds or natural openings or through tissue that has been damaged by Eastern Filbert blight. It is not quite as severe as EFB in terms of causing mortality, but it can kill trees, mainly very young ones or very stressed trees. The bacterial blight life cycle is somewhat simpler than that of Eastern Filbert blight. The bacterial overwinter in cankers in trunks and branches or in infected buds. And those cankers during wet conditions will ooze a very sticky, slimy substance that contains thousands of bacteria. And that ooze can move in water down towards plant parts below. It can infect new buds, or it can be moved from plant to plant by rain splash. The bacteria can also be spread mechanically if they get onto pruning tools or other equipment and then are moved onto other trees. And that is actually an important factor in the spread of bacterial blight between hazelnut plants. So bacterial blight landing on hazelnut plants will invade through natural openings such as pores in the leaf or through wounds. And then during the growing season, the bacteria will multiply quite rapidly on the leaves, and they'll cause leaf lesions on the stems as well. And then eventually, as the nuts begin to form, you will find lesions on the husks, and occasionally it will go on to the nuts. Cankers are thought to form mainly on the woody material like trunks and branches later in the summer, prior to their overwintering in the fall. Bacterial blight, though, can also be spread to new trees through infected nursery stock. So, for example, where you are layering a new tree onto a mother plant, you can get latent infections in that mother plant moving up into the new tree. Or if you're propagating by cutting out suckers, if the suckers are latently infected, and by latently I mean that there's no visible symptoms, you can get infection coming through those suckers. Micropropagated trees themselves will obviously have a much lower risk of contamination from bacterial blight, but if they are in a nursery where they're exposed to rain splash or contaminated pruning material from infected mature trees that are nearby, then they could become infected with Eastern Filbert blight. Infection with bacterial blight is favored by wet or rainy, humid, warm weather greater than 20 degrees Celsius. So it's quite common under Ontario growing conditions to see quite a lot of bacterial blight lesions on leaves and on husks throughout hazelnut orchards. But where the bacteria is most threatening to the trees is through those cankers. So where the cankers develop on branches and trunks, if they develop around them and girdle them, then you can get branch dieback. You can get slightly reduced yield from those affected branches, but more importantly, where a trunk is girdled, it can cause mortality of those trees. We tend to see more severe bacterial blight disease in years that follow heavy fall rains because that's more conducive to spread of the bacteria from the cankers. Also in years with a lot of freeze injury. So freeze injury does two things. It first weakens the tree and makes it less able to fight off a bacterial blight invasion, but it also creates more wounds through which the bacteria can enter. There's some research also that suggests that freeze events with a much higher difference between the high and the low can lead to a much greater increase of disease. So overall, though, where you have death from bacterial blight, that's mainly focused in young orchards. So we don't usually see it death of trees in trees greater than 6 years of age. But in young orchards, you can get tree mortality, particularly when those trees are stressed due to a moisture imbalance, attacked by other pests, etc. So that's why it's really important to have good irrigation, good control of other pests in young orchards to just keep them healthy and better able to fight off bacterial blight infections while they're establishing and growing. Bacterial blight infections are often first noticed by growers on the leaves because they're quite noticeable there. Bacterial blight infections on the leaf start as these sort of angular reddish to brownish spots on the leaves. If you look closely, they will initially be surrounded by a yellowish greenish halo. We first start to see these in late spring on hazelnut leaves once we reach those 20 degrees and above temperatures, especially where it's really rainy, when it's quite favorable to spread. And those spots can become very, very common by mid to late summer. When you have a lot of lesions, those can coalesce, especially near the tips or the edges of the leaf, as in this lower right photo. So you'll get a large necrotic area that's brown or reddish brown, and that can cover a large surface area of the leaf. As the season progresses, you will start to see lesions on the nut husks. Those are also a dark brown or sometimes a black angular lesion forming all over the husk. We don't typically see those on the nuts in Ontario, but that has been reported in other growing regions. And then you can also get lesions on the stems as well. If buds become infected, they might turn brown, they might fail to leaf out. And then there's the cankers that form on all different slices of woody tissue. So those are considerably more difficult to detect, especially to the inexperienced eye or to distinguish from other wounds on the tree, but they may appear slightly sunken. They will often look cracked where they have disrupted the bark, and they'll be reddish purple in color with a darkened underlying tissue, and the tissue may ooze a sticky liquid under moist or wet conditions. As I said, though, cankers on trunks and branches can be very difficult to detect. They may initially, if you see the photo on the left here, look just like cracks in the tree, which you might mistake for just winter cold injury or mechanical damage. Those cracks may be a little bit sunken because there's a canker there, and they may have a reddish or purplish coloring. One way to sort of really see that there may be a disease issue going on is to remove the bark, because underneath the bark, you might see a brown oozy tissue, as you might see here in this center tissue, or center photo here. But this can be quite difficult to distinguish from other causes, other pathogens that might get in there without laboratory confirmation. As with eastern filbert blight, when a bacterial blight canker girdles and kills a branch, the dead leaves may remain attached, and this does what we call flagging the presence of the disease. So in the summer, when you're out scouting and you see a dead branch, an obviously dead branch sticking out amongst a healthy tree, you will want to get closer to that tree, follow it to the base of the symptoms, and look for cankers. So bacterial blight lesions in Ontario are often contaminated with other fungi. So where we've collected samples and submitted them to the lab, we have come back with co-infections of bacterial blight with Bacteriocytes, which is a fungus, as well as Phomopsis and Fusarium. This is next to impossible to distinguish in the field to know what kind of pathogen you're dealing with, but it's important to be aware of it. So if you do take a sample and you submit it to a laboratory for confirmation, it could come back positive for both bacterial blight and other fungi. We're not really sure if the bacterial blight came first and those were secondary pathogens or vice versa, but given the frequency that we find bacterial blight in Ontario hazelnuts, we think it's likely that it's a co-infection, that the Bacteriocytes would come in after the bacterial blight was already there. The other thing to be aware of is that bacterial blight can co-occur with eastern filbert blight. So you can see that in this figure on the right. So on the left, you have a typical eastern filbert blight canker, and those are distinguished by the presence of fungal stromata. So these are these oval bump-like structures that are produced by the fungus as it erupts through the bark. Bacterial blight does not have these structures. So as you can see in the lesion here on the right, this would be bacterial blight. and as well here. So bacterial blight won't have these stromata. If you have these bumps, which are white and eventually become black, that is Eastern Filbert blight. If it does not have those structures, then you are dealing with bacterial blight. Possibly some other fungal infections could cause that as well, but not EFB. In the case of this tree, it's likely that the bacterial blight infection followed the Eastern Filbert blight infection. So bacterial blight may have invaded through wounds caused by the Filbert blight fungus, or just the infection by the fungus weakened the tree and made it more susceptible to bacterial blight. So for basic management of bacterial blight, first thing is similar to Eastern Filbert blight, where you have cankers. Removing that material over winter and destroying those cuttings can remove sources of inoculum for the following spring. With the case of bacterial blight, though, sanitizing the cutting tools becomes even more important because of the potential for spread of the bacteria on your tools. When you're scouting your orchard and you see what you think is a bacterial blight canker, you're going to want to flag it for later removal. When you're doing your winter pruning for Eastern Filbert blight, or when you're pruning for any reason, you're going to want to take out those bacterial blight cankers at the same time. With bacterial blight in particular, though, because there's the potential for that ooze to be getting on your cutting material, you're going to want to be sanitizing your pruning tools. And that can be alcohol, bleach, or some other disinfectant. And you want to have it on there long enough to remove any bacterial blight disease. And you just want to be careful, though, not to be damaging your cutting tools with your disinfectant and not to be getting the disinfectant on your trees. We mentioned this as well in the Eastern Filbert blight webinar, but you want to be removing those cuttings that have bacterial blight or Eastern Filbert blight from the orchard before they can spread to new trees. So just to sort of illustrate that, the photo on the left is pruning in the winter, and you see the pruning materials are left on the ground. You still want to get that out of there as soon as possible, but there's not that much chance of spread in the middle of the winter when it's freezing out. But as you can see in the photo on the right, these trees have been pruned and the pruning material has been left in the middle of the orchard in the middle of a rainstorm. So it is important to be aware that there is potential for spread of bacterial blight, Eastern Filbert blight under those conditions, because the bacteria are not instantly killed just because the limb has been cut from the tree. So get the pruning material out and destroyed as soon as possible. Second step in managing bacterial blight would be the application of bactericides. I'm not going to go into specific products now. Those can be found in OMAFRA Publication 360E, the Crop Protection Guide for Tree Nuts. Those change frequently, so I won't mention them here. Those sprays typically are suggested to go on in late August or September before heavy rains, because that is considered to be a prime period where those cankers form and where ooze from those cankers can spread. In very wet years, you may want to apply those again at 75% leaf drop, and then many labels allow for a spring application. So this is just bringing the yearly disease management cycle into a pictorial form. So as I mentioned, that pruning and burning of the infected material is happening in late fall through the winter before bud break in the spring. Being cautious of the fact that of timing your pruning so that's not happening right before freezing temperatures, which can injure your tree and further make it susceptible to bacterial blight. And then your sprays are going on in the fall. Fungicide and bacterial sprays go on in the fall and the spring. So these recommendations are generally based on the knowledge that we have coming out of the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, where a lot of the research has been done. And there, the focus for bacterial blight sprays is in late fall and Eastern Filbert blight sprays in early spring. However, we in Ontario have a longer dormant period, a colder winter, which may affect the movement of both of those diseases. So as we get more understanding of both Eastern Filbert blight and bacterial blight biology in Ontario, there may be an adjustment in the timing, but you may want to be considering a bacterial blight spray in the spring if you have lots of cankers, you're seeing ooze, and there's a lot of rain, because that's where there's a lot of potential for spread. After pruning and application of bactericides, then there is, of course, clean planting material. I won't go into that in great detail, but as was mentioned earlier, it is very possible for bacterial blight to spread during the plant propagation process and be introduced as a latent infection or one without visible symptoms into a new orchard. So sourcing clean plants is important. But then the next thing is reduction of moisture stress. So as we mentioned earlier, we tend to see most mortality from bacterial blight in young trees, and that is often when they are stressed, particularly because they have had insufficient moisture during those early years. So it's really important to not let roots of nursery stock dry out and to be irrigating them for at least the first 3 summers of an orchard's life. And mulching around the base of young trees as well can help keep moisture in the trees, and that just keeps the trees healthier and a little bit more able to resist infection by bacterial blight, or if they are infected, to deal with it in a fashion where the trees themselves don't die. This just illustrates that. We have 2 orchards here. The one on the left is not being irrigated, and the one on the right is irrigated. You can see the drip line along the base of the trees in the right photo. So the one on the left did have some freezing temperatures the winter previous to when this photo was taken, and bacterial blight did get in. And what we did notice is that the trees tended to have a lot more moisture stress, and we lost some of these trees, as you can see in the photo, to bacterial blight. In the orchard on the right, where the trees were irrigated regularly, there was still some bacterial blight exposure, but the trees were far more able to handle that because they were being irrigated and they weren't trying to deal with simultaneously with a bacterial blight infection and lack of adequate moisture. So final 2 general guidelines in managing bacterial blight. There is some evidence to suggest over application of nitrogen can increase bacterial blight incidence in hazelnuts, so you want to have sufficient nitrogen but not too much. And second is to closely watch plants with freeze injury. So that freeze injury in the winter can really can open up wounds through which bacterial blight can invade. And I would also add to that mechanical injury as well. So just to illustrate that, the photo on the left is a hazelnut tree that has had quite a bit of winter injury. You can see all the cracks in the bark there, and that creates a large surface area through which the bacterial blight pathogen can invade. So if there is any bacterial blight in the area surrounding that tree, there is a good chance that it's going to get in there and cause some fairly large cankers, which could be damaging to the tree. I also just wanted to illustrate the importance of pruning and avoiding mechanical injury. So in the right photo, circled in red, you can see where this tree could have dealt with some pruning. So it was improperly pruned, and you've got a branch rubbing against another branch. And in the photo to the far right, I have arrows pointing to it, but I pulled the 2 branches apart, and you can see that what that has created is a lot of rubbing between those 2 branches, and then that rubbing also creates an opening through which bacterial blight or other secondary pathogens can invade. So it's really important to avoid that, to avoid poor pruning practices or anything that can create more wounds in the tree than you already have to create through your routine orchard practices, because anything that wounds the tree can allow bacterial blight or other secondary pathogens to invade. This brings us to the end of our bacterial blight webinar. For further information, you can refer to other hazelnut related publications that are currently or soon to be available on the OMAFRA website at www.ontario.ca/crops. More details on these, as well as other resources, can be found in part 1 of this webinar series. I want to thank you for listening to this webinar. I've included my contact information on this slide should you wish to reach out with any questions or comments. I also encourage you to subscribe to our Specialty Crops blog at onspecialtycrops.ca, which features timely updates on agronomics, pest management, and events affecting specialty crop producers in Ontario, including hazelnuts.